Hey, what's going on? Ryan Nolting here with Intersection Records. We are talking band members and lineup changes and classic bands. And let me say what my take is on this. There's some examples of bands that have been around forever and have had just so many lineup changes that it's ridiculous, and maybe nobody's even an original member. There's some bad examples. There's examples that worked really well, like an AC/DC, and there's examples that didn't work really well. I'm not saying any of it's bad. I think a band still being able to go out and play, let's face it, who loses it first? The singer and maybe the drummer. Why? It's hard to hit those notes as a singer, aging in your 70s, and physical toll on your body. It's hard for a drummer. So you see those guys fall out early. Death, all kinds of things can make a guy fall out. But the people want to hear this music, and I'd rather go see some sort of lineage band with some members that have played with other guys still in the band than see nothing at all, or see some cover band. Again, there's some shameful examples of bands that are hanging out too long, and sometimes they don't even perform with any originals. Let's get started with one of the first rock bands ever, the Beatles. John, Paul, George, and Ringo. Well, those first several demos and even some of the hits that were being recorded had Pete Best on drums. Pete Best couldn't cut it. During that Pete Best era, Stuart Sutcliffe was one of the guitar players. He was the guy. He was the face guy in the band, right? Stuart was the guy that all the girls liked. He ends up being asked to leave. He ends up passing away. Pete Best is asked to leave, and the rest is history with Ringo joins. The Beach Boys. Brian Wilson, is the mastermind and songwriter and bass player of the band, along with his brothers Carl and Dennis and Mike Love. He has a nervous breakdown in 65. He does not want to fly anymore. He doesn't want to leave his bedroom for a few years. And they bring in Bruce Johnson. And they are still touring to this day in some capacity. I think there's a Brian Wilson version, and there's a Mike Love version. I don't know. Does that matter? The Rolling Stones, Ian Stewart, Charlie Watts, Mick Jagger, Keith Richards, Bill Wyman, and Brian Jones. Classic lineup. Brian Jones is tripping acid and having mental problems and acting crazy, and they have to go and kick him out of that band. They have to go and kick him out, and a few weeks later, he drowns in a swimming pool. Who do they bring in, though? Mick Taylor, formerly of John Mayall's Blues Breakers. We'll talk about that here in a minute more. He really defines that period. Let It Bleed, Sticky Fingers, Exile on Main Street, Black and Blue. It's only rock and roll I like it. He has a drug problem. He's like, I'm going to die if I don't get out of this band. Then they get Ron Wood. That band stays together until 92. From 75 to 92, you got that stable lineup. Then Wyman leaves. Daryl Jones comes in. That was stable for years until Charlie Watts passed away. And they're still going on. Pink Floyd, first album, Syd Barrett, right? Nick Mason, Richard Wright, Roger Waters. People love that first album. Pipers at the Gates of Dawn. Well, he loses his mind on acid. He's asked to leave. And they bring in David Gilmour. The rest is history. As we know, moving on, Deep Purple. You got those first few albums. I can't think of the singer's name right now, but I think Hush Hush, think of Kentucky Woman, Rob Evans. Yeah, Rob Evans. He's booted out. And then you get Ian Gillan, and you have the classic lineup of Gillan, John Lord, Ritchie Blackmore, Ian Pace, and Roger Glover on bass. Unbelievable. They're together till 73 when freaking Blackmore kicks out Ian Gillan and Roger Glover, and they pick up an unknown singer named David Coverdale and a bass player by the name of Glenn Hughes. And that band has a killer album with Burn and Stormbringer. And then, of course, Richie gets disillusioned, forms Rainbow. They bring in Tommy Bolin for an album. They break up. We won't even go through the 80s and 90s lineup changes, but Steve Morse ends up joining. Gillan, Glover, and Pace are still there. Don Airy is on keyboards now. Anyway, King Crimson. Man, they had tons of lineups, right? Greg Lake's the first singer. Think 21st Century Schizoid Man. That's Greg Lake. Greg Lake sings on the second album. Then he leaves. And they bring in Boz Burrell for an album. Then finally he leaves. They bring in my favorite lineup, which is the John Wetton on bass, Bill Bruford on drums. Bruford's original. No, he's not. What am I talking about? Bruford's not original. Of course he's not. He was in Yes. And Yes is a whole nother story. But the classic of Robert Fripp, Bill Bruford, and Wetton. Of course, Bruford's original of Yes. And that's my favorite. For Bible Black, Lark's Tongue and Aspic and Red. Then they have a whole nother 80s and 90s lineup with Tony Levin and Adrian Blue. Ultimately, Gavin Harrison's in the band. Anyway, Sabbath. So they form in Birmingham, England in 68. They put the first record out in 70. Ozzy Osbourne, Bill Ward, Geezer Butler, and Tony Iommi. That band stays together till 78. So from like 68 to 78, they have a cup of coffee with a guy named Greg Walker. They never record with him, and they bring in Ronnie James Dio, who has just left and been kicked out of Rainbow. And they do two great albums with Ronnie. Bill Ward's on board for the first album, Heaven and Hell. The second album, Mob Rules, is with Vinny Appice on drums. Then Ronnie gets kicked out, and they get Ian Gillan on vocals. They get Ray Gillan at one point. They get Glenn Hughes at one point. They got a guy named Tony Martin. They go through a series of singers. Then Ronnie comes back. Then Ronnie leaves. Then Ozzy comes back. Anyway, great band. Journey. You know, Steve Perry. Steve Perry's not original. Greg Raleigh's the original singer. Neil Sean, Ross Valerie. They have Ansley Dunbar on drums. He leaves. Steve Smith comes in. Steve Perry joins with Raleigh. So there's some killer songs with both Raleigh and Steve Perry singing. Feeling that way, ooh, and it's and then Raleigh leaves, and then Jonathan King joins on keyboards. And that's kind of another classic period where you have Smith, Valerie, Sean, Kane, and Perry. And then Ross Valerie leaves, and Randy Jackson, who would then go on to American Idol fame, joins. Then Steve Perry leaves after a reunion album in 91. In 1996 or 7, they kick Steve Perry out. He needs a hip replacement. They boot him out. That's one that fans have an issue with. People still clamor for wanting Perry in. They brought in Jeff Scott Soto. They brought in Steve Algeri. And then they finally, on the internet, found a guy from the Philippines named Arnel Pineda. And he's really revitalized that. They've had other lineup changes since then. Steve Smith and Valerie are gone. Anyway. Dean Castronova was in, then he was out. He's back in now. Okay, Rush. Most Rush fans know that the first album, the one with Working Man on it, the one with In the Mood on it, that's John Rutsey on drums. He's there just for the first album. He's a diabetic. He can't really handle touring. His diabetes does not allow him to be a rock star, frankly. And the rest is history with Pert. Pert ends up retiring the band in 2015. Pert dies. Is there rumors of Danny Carey from Tool taking over? I don't know. Maybe Mike Portnoy from Sons of Apollo. Little River Band. They've been touring for years with no original members. Nothing about the original band from Australia is anywhere near intact. These guys are all younger. I'm sure they're killer. Is it sponsored by the original band, and are they the best cover version of a Little River Band? I guess. Same kind of thing with Chicago. You have the original Terry Kath era, with Peter Cetera. When Terry Kath dies in 77, that band is a husky, jazz rock band with jam sensibilities and just killer music. And Terry Cash, the leader of that band, when he dies, Peter Cetera takes over. And yeah, I mean, they made a gazillion dollars kind of doing the love song thing. If you leave me now. I mean, just real, just, whew, the 80s stuff is rough, man. Now, then he leaves and they bring in, guys. And anyway, ZZ Top. For years, they were one of the only bands that had all the original members. And finally, Dusty unfortunately died, I think last year or the year before. And they brought in Elwood Francis, who was a guitar tech, I think for both maybe Billy and Dusty. And he's growing his beard out. He's growing his hair out. And he's taken up where Dusty left off. I used to love the way Dusty sang. He sang the song Tush. Man. Just looking for some Tush. Boston and Foreigner, Foreigner had that killer lineup with Dennis Elliott, Al Greenwood, Ian McDonald, Lou Gramm, and Mick Jones. And everybody kind of fell away other than Graham and Jones. And then finally Lou Gramm couldn't do it anymore. Kind of similar to the way that Steve Perry couldn't do it anymore. And they brought in this Kelly Hansen, and he runs around the stage and kind of owns it a little bit, but it's not the same. For me, it isn't. Again, though, it's making people happy, and they're doing huge shows. Same thing with Boston. Boston, Sid Hibian, Fran Sheehan, Barry Goudreau, Tom Scholes, and Brad Delp. I mean, the original lineup, those first two records that are killer, Boston and Don't Look Back. And then they do a long break where they do third stage, and some of those guys fall out. Goudreau and Sheehan. And finally, they do another record in '94. I saw them on that tour. It was the last tour with Brad Delp, and Fran Cosmos was helping out on vocals. And that's about all they did. Delp hung around for a few more tours and maybe another album, but he ended up killing himself in, I think, 98 or something, 99, 2000. But they're still playing. I mean, go see Boston. Tom's still there on keys, and the guitars are great, and it's still a good band. It's just Brad was so special to us, wasn't he? Brad, Lou, Graham, and Steve Perry. Man, that trio, guys. Terry Kath, too. Van Halen. David Lee Roth. Michael Anthony. Eddie Van Halen, Alex Van Halen. David Lee Roth loses his mind after their 6th album, and after 1984, and does a video for California Girls and Just a Gigolo, and thinks he's a movie star and a rock star, and he bails. And Sammy Hagar comes in, and they do a string of #1 albums. It's not as good as... By the way, subscribe to my channel. Watch my ranking the albums of Van Halen. Watch my 50 greatest guitar players show. Watch my drummer show. I have all kinds of ranking the album shows. Zeppelin. The Sammy thing's not the same. They do 4 albums with Sammy. Then Gary Cherone from Extreme joins for an album. Van Halen 3. Watch my ranking of Van Halen and see what I say about that album. He leaves, Sammy comes back, David comes back, Michael Anthony gets kicked out, Wolfgang Van Halen joins. The rest is history. In Excess, Michael Hutchinson kills himself. They do a game show, I think, or a show on TV where they're trying to find a singer. I think they're still touring in some capacity. Iron Maiden, the original band, has Paul Di'Anno on lead vocals. So Di'Anno is in the original lineup. They do the first Iron Maiden album, which is killer. They do the album Killers, which is killer. Di'Anno leaves. In comes new drummer Nico McBrain and Bruce Dickinson. And really, that's the classic lineup with Adrian Smith and the rest of those guys. It's a killer band. Just a killer band. But then Dickinson leaves in the mid-2000s. They bring in a singer named Blaze Bayley, and he does 2 records. And frankly, I've heard some of it. It's not terrible, but the people, the fans didn't like that. Kind of the same thing with Judas Priest. So you got KK. You got Glenn Tipton. Right? You got Rob Halford. You got Ian Hill on bass. they kind of have a series of drummers with Simon Phillips and Les Binks, but really they kind of hit a stride in the 80s with that classic lineup. You know, Binks ends up leaving and they bring in Scott Travis for the Painkiller album in 90. But then Rob Halford leaves and Ripper Owens takes over for a couple albums. And I think those are probably better records than the Iron Maiden, Blaze Bayley records. I don't know. But then Rob comes back for Angel Retribution, Nostradamus, Firepower. We're working on an album right now too. Chili Peppers. Guitar changes early, and drum changes early. Chad Smith finally gets there. Frusciante's been in the band, 3 times? Dave Navarro's been in. Ross Klinghoffer's been in the band. Now Frusciante's back. Let's talk about the most dangerous job in all of music, which is playing keyboards for the Grateful Dead. Pigpen's the original keyboard player. He drinks himself to death and dies in 72, I think 73 actually. Keith Gottschalk takes over. Keith and Don are in the band until 79. They leave. Keith dies in a car accident. Brent Midland joins, I think February of 79. He's in the band until 90. That's a great period, the 80s Dead. And then he dies of a drug overdose. And then Vince Welnick comes in from 90, along with Bruce Hornsby for a little bit. They play together for a little bit too. For 2 years. Finally, Jerry dies in 90, and Vince ends up dying. And of course, they never really called themselves the Grateful Dead again, which is good, right? AC/DC. Angus, Malcolm Young. Just an amazing band with amazing lead singer. He was the man. And he dies. He dies as a young man. Brian Johnson comes in. It's a good example of, a band kind of like Van Halen, but really maybe even a better example of really not losing your stride. The Back in Black album is so strong. Every single song on that record. And then, Who Made Who, and For Those About to Rock. The original band's probably the best band, probably my favorite, but rest in peace, sir. And hopefully they come back, by the way. Hopefully they come back. Scorpions. Michael Schenker and Rudolph are the original guitar players on Lonesome Crow, the first album from 1972. Claus Mines on vocals. Michael leaves and forms UFO the next year. Uli John Roth comes in to second guitar chair or lead guitar chair with Rudolph playing rhythm. He stays for a really great period. Listen to the Tokyo Tapes sometimes. One of my favorite live albums of all time. Michael comes back just for Love Drive to help record and finish that album up. He leaves. Matthias Jabs comes in, and Matthias is still there. So Claus, Matthias, and Rudolph are still there. That classic period of the band, though, you had Herman Rarebarrel and Francis Buchholz on bass. Herman the German on drums. Zeppelin is an example of a band not continuing after. John Bonham dies in 1980. And they just say, you know what, we're done. And they had a couple little reunions. They did Live Aid in 85 in Philadelphia. They did Madison Square Garden in 88 for the 40th anniversary of Atlantic Records. And of course, in 2007, they got back together for the Celebration Day with Jason Bonham. And they actually played Jason Bonham's wedding, I think, in 90 or 91. But, they didn't want to ruin that legacy. And they just called it a day. Page and Plant, of course, did a couple tours. Fleetwood Mac. So the original Fleetwood Mac spawned out of the band John Mayall and the Bluesbreakers. We already talked about that band with Mick Taylor from the Stones leaving that band. Eric Clapton had played in that band prior too also. So the rhythm section of Mayall during this period is John McVie and Mick Fleetwood. And the guitar player is a guy named Peter Green. They have some extra studio time, and May Hall tells Peter to go in the studio and work on some solo stuff. They go in, they cut a few songs, they get the tape, and Peter Green writes Fleetwood Mac on it. And they're like, why are you doing that? This is your session. He's like, no, you guys are the real deal. And they end up forming a band called Fleetwood Mac. Danny Kerwin comes, Bob Welch comes, Peter Green writes Albatross, writes Oh Well, writes Rattlesnake Shake, writes Black Magic Woman that Santana made famous. Green loses his mind, leaves the band, and ultimately in '74 they get Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham, and the classic Rumors lineup is there. Stevie leaves at one point. Lindsey leaves at one point. Dave Mason actually does an album with him, along with Bonnie Bramlett's daughter. Then the original lineup gets back together. Then Christy leaves. Then Christy comes back. Anyway, then Lindsey gets kicked out, and they bring in Mike Campbell from Tom Petty, right? Whitesnake. How many guitar players has Whitesnake had? Bernie Marsden, John Sykes, Steve Vai, Vivian Campbell, Adrian Vandenberg, you name it. Joel Holstra, the guy that was in Dio with the blonde hair, I can't think of his name. Anyway, love that band. How many great drummers have they had, too? Tommy Aldridge is still in the band. Ozzy guitar players, Randy Rhoads, right? Zakk Wylde. Why can't I think of the guitar player that was after Randy? Brad Gillis played. Brad Gillis helped them out on some tours. And then, of course, they got, we'll get back to that. I can't think of the dark-haired guy. Shit, my buddies are going to kill me on that. Shoot. He's in a band called Red Dragon Cartel. I can remember Red Dragon Cartel. We'll get back to it. Doesn't matter. Metallica. Ron McCovney, the original bass player. Ron McCovney. Then Cliff Burton, of course. Dave Mustaine's in the original band with Lars and James. Ron leaves. They kick Dave Mustaine out of the band. He goes on to form Megadeth. Cliff is killed in 1986 in a bus accident in Europe on tour, and Jason Newsted comes in for Injustice for All, for the Black Album, a few other albums, and they get Rob Trujillo on bass. Great band still to this day. Guns N' Roses, right? You got the classic lineup: Steven Adler, Izzy, Duff, Slash, and Axl. Steven Adler gets kicked out because he's taking too many drugs. God, that guitar player for Ozzy almost came to me a second ago. God, so mad at myself. Steven gets kicked out. They bring in the drummer for the Cult. Izzy Stradlin gets kicked out. They bring in Gilby Clarke. Then everybody gets kicked out, and it's just Axl. They bring in Josh Freese on drums. They bring in Buckethead and all kinds of guys. They bring in the guy from St. Louis that's in the band now. I can't think of his name. Slash and Duff finally come back, and they're still out there playing well. Chicago. Terry Kath. I don't know. We won't even talk about that again. I think we already did anyway. Paul Rogers. So Queen. Freddie Mercury. Original lineup. Roger Taylor. Brian May. Freddie dies in 1991. And they don't do anything, I think, until like 2004, 2005, when they bring in Paul Rogers from The Firm, of course, from Bad Company. And they do a successful tour. They actually do a studio album. I think it's called like From the Cosmos or Rock the Cosmos. I've heard it. It's good. Ultimately, he leaves, and they bring in the guy from American Idol who's still with them now, and he's doing a great job. They're out there killing it. Foo Fighters. What are they going to do with Taylor Hawkins? They're bringing some guy in. We don't know who it is. They deserve to bring a guy in. Again, we want to see these bands. We want to see this music. And if they can do it, let's do it in some form. Kiss. Original lineup: Ace, Peter Criss, Paul Stanley, Gene Simmons. Ace leaves, or I think, did Ace leave first, or did, I think Peter Criss left first. They brought in Eric Carr. He actually has his own makeup thing. Then Ace leaves, and they bring in Vinnie Vincent, or was it Mark St. John? I think it was Vinnie Vincent, then Mark St. John, then Bruce Kulick. And then Eric Carr passes away, and Eric Singer comes in, then Tommy Thayer's in. Then there's a reunion of the original band. Then Peter leaves again, and Eric Singer comes back. Then Ace leaves again, and they bring in Tommy Thayer again, and you know the rest of that history. It's crazy. Oh, yeah, Def Leppard. Yeah, how cool is it that when Rick Allen's arm gets broken off in a car accident on New Year's Eve, like 83, that they let him come back with one arm. Steve Smith dies, and they bring in Vivian Campbell, and that band's still going pretty strong. Alice in Chains, William Duvall takes over for Lane Staley. Man, they're really good with him. I like that example. I'm not even going to get into the Yes. I mean, John Anderson leaves. They bring in Benoit David. Then Benoit David leaves. They bring in John Davidson. They got a new bass player who's actually been in the band forever. Alan White's dead now. Bill Bruford left. Alan White's a great replacement. They've had Rick Wakeman and Jeff Downs and Jobson, Eddie Jobson. I mean, they've had so many guys in that band. Anyway, The Who, Kenny Jones. This is a long video. We could talk about this again. Peace out. Subscribe to my channel. Thanks for listening. God, what's the guitar player's name from Red Dragon Cartel? Oh, I'm so mad at myself. Anyway, see ya. Peace.